and welcome to my forecast for the Lunar New Year, which coincides with the new moon in Aquarius that happens for most people on the 1st of February 2022. So this is quite a big deal in the astrological calendar and also in the calendar of many Asian cultures, including China, where it's considered to be the sort of original New Year, if you like. It marked the start of spring, and in I Ching it is associated with the river mountain festivals, which were spring rites, when communities would kind of gather after the hard winter, the isolation of winter, to sort of commune, and very often this would be where relationships formed and would lead to marriages in the autumn. So it's very much associated with that kind of spring fertility, the potential that spring has, that kind of fertile abundance. And as such, it's associated with hexagram 10 in the I Ching, which is all about the tiger. And the tiger in China is, I suppose, the equivalent of the lion in Western cultures, where it's associated with kind of courage, with strength, with power, and also with fertility and fecundity. So really, really interesting that this is going to be the year of the tiger. It's the year of the water tiger as well. This only happens once every 60 years, I believe, so it is quite a big deal. With the Chinese calendar, we are talking about Jupiter cycles. That's why it's usually in sort of sexagesimal figures. Every Jupiter sort of moves through a sign once every year, and every 12 years it repeats. So it's very interesting that this coincides with the original system developed in kind of Mesopotamia and the Near East to measure things like planets and also time. We still use the sexagesimal system to mark time. We have sort of 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, and so on. And that is a leave over from the sexagesimal system, which, as it turns out, is actually more accurate in many respects than the decimal system, because it allows for sort of divisions into I think it's kind of fractions. I'm not up entirely on my maths, but two Australian mathematicians have kind of showed this when they looked at a tablet called Plimpton 369, I think, and how the Babylonians used to use this to measure. It was almost a kind of a mathematical form of geometry, and they have shown that the so-called Pythagorean theorem about the equilateral triangle actually comes from Mesopotamia. That's more than likely the Greeks inherited it from the Mesopotamians, and that's where Pythagoras got it from. So super interesting. But I'm going to do something slightly different, because I've already done a Bitcoin forecast only about a week ago. I thought what I'd do is I would look at the Bitcoin chart, look at the energies around this particular new moon, because it is a big deal. As I say, it does start the Lunar New Year. But then I thought I'd do something different based on some requests from subscribers on my YouTube channel who've asked me to look at the chart of Michael Saylor. And of course, Michael Saylor is the sun Aquarius. This moon falls in the sign of Aquarius, and he celebrates his birthday on the 4th of February, which is when Mercury stations direct. So it seemed kind of a good thing to do. And also, as we'll see when we look at some of the synastry between his chart and the Bitcoin chart, and then the transits that are around at this Lunar New Year, I think we'll see that there's some very interesting sort of stuff, some very interesting kind of overlaps and sort of placements and things that could be important going forward. So, as I said, first up, we were going to look at the February 2022 chart for this new moon that happens on the 1st of February. And it's kind of interesting because we've got the sun and the moon with Saturn sitting on the Bitcoin descendant. So this is quite an important angular placement. This is the part of the chart associated with stakeholders, with people who invest in Bitcoin, with kind of significant others in relation to Bitcoin. Sometimes it can also be about enemies. We do need to kind of bear that in mind. And we did see that when Mercury kind of passed close to Saturn in Aquarius, that it did coincide with some announcements by the Fed, which then led to that kind of panic in the market that we saw in December, particularly particularly, and that kind of bled into January when people kind of got a bit scared that they were going to make a similar sort of statement. It's clear that their kind of policy has hardened, but as someone said recently, and I thought quite astutely, it isn't really their job to make sure that sort of shares and assets continue to go up. We are in an asset bubble, and I do think we need to remember that we are kind of in that up wave, that fifth wave that we saw in the Elliott wave schema of Robert Prechter's, and that bubble can't kind of go up forever. It's sort of impossible, but I don't think it's done yet, as I said in my previous video. So I think, as I say, it's interesting that we've got Saturn here. Saturn's an interesting one in astrology, although we tend to think of it quite negatively here in the West because we're so obsessed with freedom and with not having any limits or constraints. In the ancient world, Saturn was associated with important limits such as boundaries, for example, and also with kind of features of materialism. So for example, and this is something that I'm going to get into when I do my other new moon forecast, is that sometimes in order to sort of create something, to manifest something, you've got to have limits, and that's because you have to have kind of almost like brackets that separate something off from the sort of potential of the all in order to become a something. In the same way that individuals, even though we might be fractals of the whole, there's that Rumi saying about, you're not just a drop in the ocean, you're the entire ocean in one drop, but you still are a differentiated drop. And I think that it's important to consider Saturn in that context, in that in order for things to manifest in the material realm, there has to be differentiation, there has to be limits, or kind of if you think about Saturn and skin, your skin is what sort of holds you as a kind of body together, and is what makes you like one human entity, as opposed to just kind of a whole lot of water and and gas that just sort of merges with everything around it. So in that sense, Saturn isn't always bad, and we do have to remember that in this chart, Saturn does sit in the second house of value, which does often indicate increases in value. The problem being, of course, that we've had transiting Neptune kind of sitting kind of on the Bitcoin Uranus, which rules the descendant actually, and opposing Saturn from there. So that's been in kind of orb since at least September. And we have to kind of wait for that to pass. And we are also waiting for transiting Uranus to move back through the degrees of Taurus, through which it retrograded, in the months, the end months of 2021. So it has to kind of get back to Taurus, to 17 Taurus here, to the part of fortune, for things to really be kind of looking up in terms of, price and all-time highs and that kind of thing, in my opinion. And we can also see that the Sun and the Moon here are in a kind of a T-square with Uranus. So this is creating tension. It's almost highlighting the tensions that we felt back in, I would say, from the end of November onwards, when I did that lunar eclipse forecast, where we moved into orb of that Saturn-Uranus square. And these are two very slow-moving planets. So as I said, it's not surprising that with Uranus having stationed on the 18th of January and now moving back over the same degrees that it kind of occupied at the time of the 24th of December square with Saturn, that we're kind of feeling aftershocks. So I don't think that's going away immediately, but I do think that there is some good news with this new moon that I think we'll see more clearly when we get into further on in the forecast. But yes, needless to say, we do have this T-square, and at the apex is Uranus. And I think that's why at this new moon, I don't know about you, but I certainly am feeling a lot of nervous tension, like excess nervous energy, and that's quite common actually when you've got Uranus transits, particularly difficult ones, that it can lead to anxiety, kind of nervous tension, restlessness, antsiness, that kind of thing. So I think we shouldn't be surprised if we see some of that in the market as well, that people start to kind of get fired up again, but they're a little bit nervous, and so you might see some erratic behavior, rather than sort of euphoria immediately, but I do think that we will see a pivot in the energies. It's almost like the tide turning, and of course that takes a while for the the tide coming back in again takes a while to happen. So I don't think it's going to be an overnight process, but I do think we are going to feel and sense a kind of a sea change in how things are in terms of the crypto market. So so that's worth kind of bearing in mind. And also with Mercury still retrograde until around about the 4th of February, Mercury is going to kind of stop, turn, and then go back towards Pluto. And as we know, Pluto transits in relation to Bitcoin do tend to be a little bit iffy, because they rule the fifth house of speculation. So that can very often coincide with with a lot of leverage or kind of stimulation in the futures market, if you like. And speculation, and sometimes that can lead to crashes when kind of leveraged positions get wiped out. So that's just worth bearing in mind that will kind of happen in February. But then Mercury will move back towards Jupiter, the Bitcoin Jupiter, which I think will be about will coincide with some good news. And then it kind of moves back up towards Mercury and the other planets in the 7th house, which generally speaking are quite positive when it comes to Bitcoin. So the other thing to say, of course, is that on the 29th of January, Venus stationed, so that's really good news. And Venus is now moving back into orb of a similar pattern that she had actually at the time of the December solar eclipse, when Venus, Mars, and Jupiter were kind of coming together. And what happened at that time was that before Venus and Mars could perfect their I think it was a sextile at the time, Venus turned retrograde, so she kind of pulled away and started moving in the opposite direction, and Mars kind of shot forward and sort of moved into the next sign. But now the two are coming back into orb of each other, and we're actually due to have two really lovely conjunctions in February and in March, first in Capricorn and then in Aquarius. So this could be again really positive for Bitcoin, because Mars first of all rules the midheaven of the chart. So this is always about aspiration, success, wanting to do better, to increase, to improve, that kind of thing, because it is associated with the position of the sun at midday. And of course Venus in the Bitcoin chart rules the IC, so the fundamental kind of roots of Bitcoin, to keep it kind of healthy. And it also, because it's a dual sign, it also it co-rules Taurus, which rules the 11th house. And as I say, this is the sign where we tend to see kind of wealth markers, or kind of highs, or movements upwards, particularly if planets aspect the pot of fortune positively, because this is the Arabic lot that is associated most with wealth and with good luck and good fortune, in the astrology chart. So I think the key thing here is that the luminaries are on the Bitcoin descendant, and they are conjunct the Bitcoin North Node. So I think what happens now is going to be kind of fated. There's an important aspect of certain key players or moving parts kind of setting things in motion that I think ultimately are like dominoes and will kind of end up having a positive effect. But I don't think it's going to sort of happen straight away. And then, of course, as I said, transiting Jupiter in Pisces is applying to both Venus and Mars as they head for their reunion, first of all on the 16th of February, and then again in early March. And of course, Jupiter is the great benefic. It does expand, it does increase, and so that should also bode very well for Bitcoin, and just generally for the kind of euphoric mindset that you need to create those highs, those kind of spikes upwards. So I think we're kind of setting things up. It's almost like a chessboard, and certain things are moving into position, and we won't necessarily see the results of this immediately. I think we do need to consider that there are usually 12 to 13 lunar months in a year, and so this could kind of play out over over the long term, given that it is the start of the Lunar New Year. And of course, in March, at the equinox, we'll have the Solar New Year as well. And that's also really important for Bitcoin because it has Leo rising. So, but I think we will start to feel ourselves moving out of fear once we get past this Uranus T-square. And that kind of panic, and back into a slightly a much more settled energy moving forward, and particularly as we move into February and to March, which have some really lovely aspects happening, including a beautiful sextile between Jupiter excuse me, and Neptune. So that should really help with this opposition that we've got here, that's really sort of keeping price down, I feel, and is sort of almost creating like a bleed out effect. Neptune tends to dissolve borders, so it's almost the opposite to Saturn, while Saturn sort of solidifies and strengthens, kind of boundaries and helps things to manifest in the 3D world in physical form. Neptune is the great dissolver, so it's almost that energy of us leaving our bodies and kind of leaving the material realm. So that's why it can be associated with poor boundaries, or with escape, or with things like floods, things that sort of push past their boundaries, like a river that floods its banks, or a dam that overflows, that kind of thing. So yeah, but as I say, I think overall very positive that Venus is direct now. Mercury will also be direct soon. That should really help with kind of the confused energy that we've seen around. And I think that from here on in we should notice things starting to pivot again. So that's really good. So in terms of like the new moon itself and the gates that it kind of activates in the Bitcoin chart, the sun and the moon fall in hexagram 19 line 6, which is in the root center. So this is very important because obviously this is all about abundance, it's about financial security, it's about feeling grounded, and about being able to take steps to secure oneself financially. Now, what's super interesting is that hexagram 19 is called nearing or approach, and it's usually described as something great approaching something small. So in sort of I Ching terms, this is very auspicious, and it talks about a coming time of abundance, progress, and prosperity, and is also associated with revolution. So the call to advance or to charge forward, which I think is so exemplified in that this idea of Bitcoin being able to kind of revolutionize and take us into a new financial era, away from all the kind of problems of the past. So as I say, it is associated with this idea of something great approaching something small. And what they emphasize in the I Ching is that it's important to allow this great influence to draw near in its own time and way, and not try to rush the process, so not rush to completion. So they kind of equated with like harvest, and you can't sort of rush a harvest. You have to kind of go through the motions of watering and pruning and feeding and all that kind of stuff. And when things are ready to bloom, they will. And I think this speaks to of, as I say, the coming kind of new cycle that we're starting with this February new moon, which I think also kind of coincides with the sea change for Bitcoin, but it's not going to be one that's going to happen overnight, as I said in my previous forecast. So we have to sort of work towards the harvest, but not expect it immediately. And then to get more specific, we're talking about line 6, which is all about generosity, wealth, and power. And it actually says that these are drawing near. So again, I think this is a really positive sign, giving us that sort of confirmation that the Bitcoin bull run is not over. So the advice is to hold on to your sense of inner purpose and be generous with your winnings or spoils. So something important is returning, welcome it back. And I think what is important, what is returning is this incoming tide again, as we sort of pivot into a new lunar cycle and away from all that kind of fear and anxiety that we saw in December and January with that Saturn-Uranus square. So that's super interesting. And it also keys into a channel in the Bitcoin chart, channel 1949, which is the channel of sensitivity. So you can see it here connecting up the root to the emotional center. And in human design terms, this is about connecting principles and desires with connecting principles with needs or desires. So you can see how this would work on a tribal level, where people really want to improve their circumstances, they want to do well for their family, so in that sense, it unites people and creates inclusion through compassionate wisdom and support. So, again, something that that I think people can really kind of get behind this idea of Bitcoin as hope, and it's what really sort of helps to um, unite people who may have differences in a lot of other areas of their life. I think that's what's quite unique about the Bitcoin community, is that it really attracts people from all walks of life, different political persuasions, different sort of religious beliefs, but everybody is united in the sense of wanting things to be better, like for themselves, for their families, for humanity. So yeah, I think that this channel really kind of speaks to that, and I hope that we'll see a kind of a reaffirmation of that as we move into the waxing moon cycle, over the next 2 weeks. So for the second part of this forecast, as I say, I thought I'd do something slightly different. I've had quite a few people ask me to do astrological profiles of some of the crypto luminaries, if you like, the kind of the whales or the key players in the crypto space. And I thought it would be good to start with Michael Saylor, because his birthday is on the 4th of February, as I said. He's a Sun Aquarius, and this new moon happens in Aquarius. So we're going to look at his chart next. I have actually done a piece where I've looked in detail at his natal chart, particularly in relation to Bitcoin and that kind of thing, on my blog. So you can go and check that out if you're interested in this. This is designed to kind of dovetail with that. So we're going to look more at transits and also human design and that kind of thing. So take it another step further. So here we've got the Michael Saylor's chart with the Lunar New Year transposed on it. And it's so interesting, actually. The synastry is ridiculous. So if we look, we can see that this new moon is practically on Michael Saylor's sun, and that's because the sun moves 1 degree a day, and you can see that he's only sort of 4 days or so away from his solar return. So, but very interesting that it's almost as though, as we have this Lunar New Year, that it's almost as if it's a kind of in a sense like a fresh start for him, and that also he may in turn be important in sort of catalyzing certain events that are going to be important for Bitcoin. We've also got Jupiter in Pisces rising, because he's got the ascendant in Pisces with Saturn rising. So it's super interesting, the transiting Jupiter, which, as I said, is coming into orb with this really lovely, first of all, sextile to Neptune, and secondly, aspects to Venus and Mars, is sitting kind of on his ascendant. So this is very expansive energy. It's very bullish. It also kind of ameliorates Saturn when it gets a little bit too depressed or negative or kind of overly pessimistic, if you like, or sort of afraid to take risks. So I think it's balancing that energy out quite nicely. And then Saturn's not far behind. It's sitting with the luminaries here. So it's almost, I mean, it's exactly on his sun, which is super interesting. And if we look at what that rules in his chart, first of all, the sun in his chart rules the 6th house of kind of health and work, and Saturn rules his 11th house of kind of groups and kind of ideals and kind of altruistic projects and things. So I do think that somehow this conference that he's holding now, which is aimed at mainly institutional investment in Bitcoin, it could be really pivotal for the crypto space. He has been very instrumental in getting important players into Bitcoin, like Elon Musk, for example, and Jack Dorsey as well, and several other people. So, in effect, we do have him to thank for kind of spearheading the sort of the ideology that has been so contagious in actually getting institutional investment on board, and that is what has led to those incredible highs that we saw starting, back in December of 2020. So, we shouldn't kind of underestimate the importance here of Michael Saylor as a kind of visionary for Bitcoin and what it could do and what it could bring. He's he always says Bitcoin is hope, and I think Jupiter rising it really kind of exemplifies that, if you like. So I think it's super, super interesting. So as I was saying, Neptune is also going to be important, because Jupiter and Neptune are coming into all of the sextile that's going to happen, I think, in February. And Neptune in this chart is conjunct Michael's moon, which is in Pisces, along with Chiron here in the first house. So that's an interesting one. As I say, if we consider that it's in the 8th house of the Bitcoin chart, where it represents funds like, ETFs and investment sort of vehicles, if you like derivatives, or where you can invest in Bitcoin indirectly, if you like, which institutions like, because they feel as though they don't have to necessarily buy and hold the asset. They can get somebody else to sort of manage all of that for them. And of course, with his kind of micro strategy, we have seen how when he decides to go on a buying spree, how it can really affect the market. And I mean, he is very much a conviction investor. He's in it for the long term. He's not really too concerned about the sort of the short-term time horizon, and he doesn't kind of waver too much when we have kind of dips and crashes. So I think it's interesting that he's got Neptune, as I say, sitting on his moon, because from here it contacts the nodes. So you can see the nodes here. Now, he's got some really interesting nodes, actually, sort of right on his IC-MC axis. So it means that, in a sense, like what he chooses to do for a living, or what he sees his role in terms of career and what he wants to achieve in life, is somehow linked into fate. And as we saw in the previous chart, the nodes are activated at this February new moon as well in the in the Bitcoin chart, through the placements of the planets at the new moon. So somehow there's this fated element to whatever's happening now that we might not be able to sort of see or understand straight away. But I think, looking back, we'll kind of go, oh wow, yes, okay, I can see now how that all kind of came together and played an important role kind of in proceedings. So I think it's something that we need to kind of keep our eye on. But I do feel that he's a key player in what happens with Bitcoin next. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this conference, whether he does manage to convince more institutional players to come on board, because of course that could be extremely bullish for Bitcoin. And then Uranus is making a conjunction to his natal Jupiter. And you can see transiting Uranus here. Now, this is extremely bullish. I also find this extremely bullish. If we think that transiting Uranus in the Bitcoin chart sits, it's in the 10th and it's moving back to the 11th, to that part of fortune. Now, this is the same transiting Uranus that's moving towards his Jupiter in the 2nd house, which is all about money and about wealth creation and about property. And he does talk a lot about Bitcoin as digital property. So I think it's super interesting that it'll be super interesting to see what happens as that transiting Uranus moves to 17 Taurus, because that is exactly, we'll see this in a minute, it is exactly where the Bitcoin part of fortune is, 17 degrees of Taurus. So I don't think that it's a coincidence that that he has kind of got into Bitcoin. It all seems kind of extremely fate to me and extremely bullish. So I think that's something to watch between now and June, because I think transiting Uranus will only get to 17 degrees or so of Taurus in around about June. But definitely one to watch, and it's interesting, as I said, that it's in his 2nd house of wealth, assets and property. So that's worth watching. And then finally, we've got Mercury and Pluto, transiting Mercury and Pluto here at about 24 and 26 of Capricorn. Mercury still retrograde, but about to to change direction on Michael Saylor's birthday. I mean, again, the sort of the synastry of this is, you can't kind of make this up. So Mercury and Pluto on his Venus, from where it is trine to his Virgo stellium in the 7th house, which is also super interesting. So his Venus also in the 11th house. So I think this points to his somewhat more altruistic philosophical side, which we can kind of see in the way that he describes Bitcoin as being like Sophia and And he talks a lot about Bitcoin as hope. He talks about it as having the potential to elevate people who have been completely disempowered in the current financial system. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, as I say, once Mercury kind of stations, and how it sort of interacts with first of all Pluto, and secondly with his Venus, once it starts to move forward, because then it will be kind of crossing over first of all that Pluto again, so it will kind of move back towards Pluto, and it will also make a conjunction to this Venus. And in Michael's chart, it rules the third house of communication, and of kind of news and self-expression, that kind of thing, and also things like cars or vehicles. So that might somehow be important, and then it also co-rules the cusp of his eighth house, which is where his chart ruler is, Neptune in Scorpio. So very much geared towards kind of consulting, advising people financially, and also with kind of joint funds, like as I say, ETFs and investment vehicles, that kind of thing. So that will also be, it'll be interesting to see if there are announcements around about that time concerning people onboarding, big players onboarding. So yes, I mean, that to me is looking super, super interesting. Now let's look at Bitcoin and Michael Saylor's chart in a little bit more detail. Oh, jokes. But before we sort of move on to the comparison between Michael Saylor's chart and Bitcoin, I thought we'd look at some of the key things in human design, because this brings in the I Ching, and of course we are talking about, as I say, New Year in many Asian countries, including China, and the I Ching itself was originally a kind of a lunar oracle. So I think it's always interesting to look at human design placements, particularly at things like gates that are activated, to see what extra information it can give us, which we can lay on top of the astrology. So first of all, it's worth saying that the Michael Saylor is a manifesting generator, and what this means is that he's a hybrid of two former types of kind of aura types, if you like, that kind of preceded sort of modern man, if you like, kind of post the French Revolution, when we, according to human design, we kind of got an upgrade, and we started to move towards moving from the sort of the traditional seven-centered chakra system of the sort of the Brahman chakras, of Indian, of many of the sort of the Indian systems, the Vedic systems, the yogic systems, to a nine-centered being. And that's why in the human design chart you've got kind of 9 centers. So the top one is the crown, this one is the third eye, or the ajna, which is associated with the mind. Then we've got the throat, which is associated with manifestation and self-expression. We've got the G center, which is all about identity and kind of self-love, self-confidence, and a sense of self as well, having a strong sense of self. We've then got what they call the heart or the will center. And then this is the solar plexus, or the emotional center, which is actually where he has authority. So he is a manifesting generator with emotional authority, which again is interesting, because it means that in order for him to make a decision, he has to rely not on his mind but on his emotions to make a decision. But he's got to cycle through what they call the emotional wave, which kind of works on a sort of similar premise to the lunar cycle. So it's always a good idea for him to sleep on something and not to sort of make a decision immediately, to make sure, to kind of test his emotions, to make sure that he feels that it's the right decision to make. So that's the first thing to say. And we'll come back to this when we look at the Bitcoin chart. So the other thing is that as a manifesting generator, he's this type is unique in the sense that it's unlike the two previous types, which were almost sort of ran along feudal lines. You had the kind of the manifester who could command power and who could make things happen, but who wasn't connected up to what they call a motor center, which is like an energetic center that powers the vehicle, if you like. So they would have to rely on generators who have a lot of life force energy, or who are almost like the sort of worker bees or the serfs, if you like, to actually carry out these orders. And then later, as we sort of evolved, the two things started to come into a kind of a hybrid form, and this is what the manifesting generator is. Now, there are two types of manifesting generator. I won't get into this too much, but there is the sort of what they call the generator who has manifesting abilities. In other words, they have a motor center, but it's connected up to the throat. So in this case, Michael's center of authority is the the solar plexus, and you can see it's connected up via this channel here to the throat center. And then you have what they call mani-genies, which are actually manifestors who have generating ability. In other words, they have a connection to a motor center, and from there, so they're essentially manifestors first and foremost, unlike this type, which is actually a generator first and foremost with manifesting abilities. So anyway, this type is very good for the entrepreneurs. They have a lot of drive, a lot of energy. The key thing is that they have to test things out to make sure that before they commit, to make sure that it's something that they really want to do. And I think we could see this in terms of his career path. That initially he sort of experimented with different careers. He first went into the military, and then he sort of tried some various kind of experiments during the dot-com boom until he found his stride with consulting and that kind of thing. So I think that fits with the kind of the manifesting generator. It also fits with his 3-5 martyr heretic type, which is about wisdom through learned experience. So the line 3 is all about learning the hard way. In other words, learning through your own experience. You don't learn through books or through other people's experience. You have to kind of go through the hard knocks of life in order to sort of learn your lessons and work out what works for you and what doesn't. And then the fifth line, which is in the upper trigram, which is all about, kind of being a teacher and being a spokesman. And I think in a lot of ways that is what Saylor is for the, for the Bitcoin community. He kind of holds that that central idea about what Bitcoin could be, the sort of the hopes and things. So it's very interesting. Now, what's also super interesting about his chart is that he has the unconscious luminaries in gates 1 and 2. And of course, in the cosmology of the I Ching, these are the two most important gates. These are sort of the primary yin and yang gates of creation, of primordial creation. So this is the dragon in the field. And you can see them here in the G center. We've got hexagram 1, which is that sort of primal yang energy, and then we've got hexagram 2 beneath it, which is the primal yin energy. And these two together make up what they call in human design the magnetic monopole. These are the two primary binaries that activate your human design and key you into the sort of the overarching cosmic design crystal, as they call it, in human design cosmology, which ultimately determines your life path or your destiny, or what they call the geometry or shape of your life. So to have these two activated is quite unusual. Usually you'll find that people have one or the other. They don't often have both. And I think it's super interesting because I think it speaks of a signature in his chart, which is all about trying to integrate kind of masculine and feminine energy, yin and yang, of somebody who comes from a very sort of alpha male background of kind of the military and a family that has sort of a background in the military, and yet is a very sensitive, empathic and intuitive person, with all that kind of Pisces energy that we saw, Pisces moon and a prominent Neptune and that kind of thing. So I think he epitomizes what I was talking about I think it's the full moon, in the Sturgeon moon that we had back in August or so of 2021, when I talked about this idea of the androgyne, this sort of new man, the anthropos, that we're kind of, as a species, moving towards, more of an integration between masculine and feminine energies. And I think, in a way, he kind of, he represents that. It's kind of represented in his chart with these two gates that are activated. So that's super interesting. And then the other thing is that a lot of his chart is about integrating imagination with knowledge and helping humanity to make an important shift. And, in the sense, I think, he's very good at telling a story and helping us to maintain a kind of a vision, if you like, which we can then use to sort of, as a collective, to rewrite our story, particularly those people who in the Bitcoin community. So I think that's really, interesting. I think it also speaks to his role, on social media. I think he helps to sort of keep everyone on track, everyone motivated, and in that sense, I think he has a very important role to play in sort of keeping people motivated, especially during crypto winters. So yeah. Okay, so now let's look at the synastry between his chart and that of Bitcoin, because it is so fascinating. Now, bear in mind that, Michael Saylor was born in 1965, and, Bitcoin only kind of came into being in 2009. So there's a vast kind of expanse there in terms of years. So to find such interesting synastry between these two charts, I think is quite fascinating. So, yes, if we start with that... with the Bitcoin Saturn, which, as I said, sits in the second house of Bitcoin, in terms of price and value, that Saturn is conjunct his Mars, Pluto, Uranus stellium in the seventh house. So that's super interesting because it almost sort of points to Bitcoin as an other, as a significant other for Michael Saylor. That it almost is something that he feels very strong that he wants to commit to, almost like a marriage. And, Saturn can be very important in romantic synastry in the sense of stabilizing relationships, of giving the sort of the stability and the foundation that a relationship needs to last. So I think it's super interesting that, as I say, that we have this combination because, he has some very interesting oppositions in his chart. He's got what a lot of people born around about this time have, which is a set of oppositions between the planets in Pisces and Virgo, which can be quite tricky. It can be quite polarizing, like internally. I've seen it in quite a few people born in this time, where it makes people feel very pulled and sort of conflicted, and they can kind of bounce from the sort of the very soft energy of Pisces into the quite critical and sometimes sharp energy of Virgo. And a lot of people spend like most of their lives trying to sort of find the balance between this opposition. In some people, I've heard people say, a friend of mine is married to somebody who has this combination, and I remember sort of initially when they were kind of getting to know each other, she was concerned that he might have suffer from bipolar kind of disorder, and I think it can feel that way. If we think that an opposition is really about two extremes, two binaries at kind of opposite ends of the spectrum, that it can be quite difficult to sort of hold that energy. And so I think it's super interesting that we've got Saturn here, the Bitcoin Saturn, which almost kind of stabilizes, him in the sense that it gives him one thing to focus on. And that's what he's done. It's almost like he's focused on that, almost to the exclusion of everything else. That's not entirely true. He does have a consulting business as well. But, he certainly is a Bitcoin maximalist. And it's interesting because I think in as much as he's good for Bitcoin, I think Bitcoin's good for him. So I think that's super interesting. And also a lot of this Mars, Pluto, Uranus energy is, as I said in my article, it does kind of factor into a lot of the his planetary indicators surrounding money and that kind of thing. Because first of all, Aries rules his second house cusp, so Mars is important. And then, we've also got his chart ruler Neptune in Scorpio in the 8th house. So, in that sense, Pluto is important. And then Uranus is, of course, the ruler of his Aquarius sun. So that's also, kind of interesting. So it's a very powerful combination of energy, and it's quite focused. It can be very precise, and I think what he is very good at is balancing this kind of precision and this what's the word? He's not someone who's very verbose, so he's quite precise often in what he says, but it comes often after you can sort of feel that there's this impetus behind it of kind of empathy, compassion, and sensitivity. And I think it's probably something that he's kind of honed over the years, where he's able to make these pithy statements that really, can help somebody, or sort of just make the difference between, having a sort of a, seeing things from kind of glass half full or glass half empty, that kind of thing. So in that sense, I think he's very good at motivating. So that's interesting. And then the Bitcoin Uranus is conjunct his moon Chiron. So we can see here that important Uranus that we talked about in the last two charts, that, in the Bitcoin chart, that it is in Pisces, and that it sits, so close to his moon. So it's almost like there's a kind of an, I don't want to say an emotional or a kind of intuitive relationship there, but I think that he's able to read the market very well, in that emotional sense, because don't forget that he's got emotional authority. So I think he's able to gauge what investors are going to do. If we think about Uranus as being the ruler of the descendant in the Bitcoin chart, that's a real kind of gift. And also I think with the moon being close to Chiron, that this can often be the wounded healer. So I think through maybe having learned harsh lessons, through that's the experience of the 3-5 sort of modus operandi, that he's able to kind of impart some wisdom and sometimes, and often calm people down when they are getting a little bit sort of erratic, or that kind of thing. So I think that's super interesting. And then the Bitcoin pot of fortune, as I said, you can see it here exactly on his Jupiter in the second house in Taurus. So I think this really kind of, if nothing else, astrologically says how important he is for Bitcoin and where Bitcoin is going, particularly in terms of its kind of its health, its abundance, and and what it's worth, and that this is mutually beneficial. That as Bitcoin's price goes up, so obviously his wealth increases, because he has invested his faces billions, in this particular asset. So that is really super interesting. And you can see that it also forms part of a minor grand trine here with some of his stuff in the seventh house, and with Black Moon Lilith. So really, really, really interesting, and does look very, very bullish and positive. So yes, that's interesting. And then the other benefic, the Bitcoin Venus, which is again very important for tops and all-time highs, that is rising on his ascendant. I mean, as I say, like, you can't make this stuff up. It's unreal, the synastry. So again, kind of pointing to Venus, the Bitcoin Venus as that Sophia figure. I think this is where it comes from, possibly, like on a kind of, from an astrological perspective, this idea of Bitcoin as Sophia, as a woman, this kind of figure, this benevolent figure that can, that can uplift people and reform the sort of the financial sector to sort of get rid of corruption and that kind of thing. But also I think that it does point to wealth making as well. That Bitcoin does have the potential to really make Michael Saylor a wealthy man. So this does look like that's a gamble that's well worth taking. If we're looking at all this science, we can see why he's all in on Bitcoin. And then the other thing is the Bitcoin North Node, which is conjunct his Sun. So again, I mean, this looks a very fated connection or relationship. And I'd be interested to learn the backstory into how he got into Bitcoin, because I'm not actually sort of a fay with that. But it does look as though there was some element of fate involved here with the Sun and with those nodes. So that's super interesting. And then what else is interesting is that both the Bitcoin chart and Michael Saylor share the placement of Mercury in Aquarius. So you can see Mercury here at 1 degree of Aquarius, and you can see the Bitcoin Mercury at 2 degrees. So very, very close to each other in terms of kind of zodiacal position. And again, that's also quite rare. So yes, again, kind of pointing to this kind of simpatico, this meeting of minds on some level. And he does seem to understand Bitcoin in a way that maybe, very few other people do. And so, it'll be interesting to see over time if he's kind of proven right in terms of his model for Bitcoin. Yes. And then finally, as I said, we've got the Bitcoin Jupiter conjunct his Venus. So this is the combination of the two benefics again. So you can see here his Venus at 29 degrees of Capricorn and the Bitcoin Jupiter at exactly 29 Capricorn as well. So again, this is also very bullish, and it does suggest that what's good for the one is good for the other, and that they are together a very bullish combination, generally sort of speaking. And again, you can see that this keys into his Mars here, with this trine between Venus and Mars, both in Earth signs. So given that that's the ruler of his second house, I can see why he went all in on Bitcoin, is all I can say. So yes, I mean, incredible synastry, and yes, if you want to say, is it a match made in heaven? I would definitely say so. So I think that, what's good for Bitcoin is good for Michael Saylor, and vice versa, and I think, the astrology really kind of speaks to that. So anyway, moving on to human design, I thought I'd look at some of the synastry between the Bitcoin chart and Michael Saylor. So again, what's super interesting about these two charts is that Bitcoin, as I say, is quite a rare type. It's a 4-1 opportunistic investigator, which is quite a rare type these days. You're finding less and less of this particular combination. And it's also a manifester, and it has emotional authority, just like Michael Saylor does. So this is super, super interesting, because it does really speak of Bitcoin as the wealth maker, as from an energetic point of view, as as being able to kind of almost switch on other people's channels, so that if they don't have the ability to sort of generate wealth in the current financial system, that the Bitcoin is super empowering. Because this is what happens in human design, is that you have planets in gates. So all these blue kind of numbers are where planets sit, and they essentially switch on what they call gates. And then if there is a planet on the other side switching on the opposite gate, again this idea of binaries, then it activates a channel. So and very often it will switch on both centers. So it'll give people more conscious control over a center, and make them less kind of susceptible to social conditioning, and to like brainwashing, or that kind of thing, that they become more in charge of their own destiny, if you like. So I mean, I think it's so interesting that, the only center that isn't sort of activated in the Bitcoin chart is the sacral center. And this is a life force energy that I think investors bring to the party. So, they are what's essentially power Bitcoin. They are the kind of lifeblood of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin, in turn, switches on at other channels and empowers them. So it's a kind of a two-way street. So yes, I mean, that's super interesting. So I thought, we'd look at some of the shared gates that these two kind of players have, and the first, of course, is those centers that I talked about in the G center. So you can see that both Bitcoin and Michael Saylor have gates 1, 7, and 13, all kind of lit up. You can see it here as well. Bitcoin has more, but it doesn't have the 2, and this is what Saylor has. So I do think that that's interesting. That somehow maybe he helps to kind of soften Bitcoin, because I mean, with that Mars Pluto conjunction, Bitcoin can be quite hardcore. We can kind of we can see that Pluto, the conscious Pluto, sits in gate 10, which is essentially the hexagram that's activated by this February new moon, which is associated with. It begins the year of the tiger, and the tiger is associated with hexagram 10 in the I Ching. So this is extremely interesting overlap, and this is all about kind of raw power, sort of life force energy, and the ability to survive no matter what. So I think that is kind of super interesting, because it is, in that sense, it switches on a channel that Michael wouldn't normally have. He's got the 34, but he doesn't have the 10. So it switches on the 3410 channel of exploration, but which is also very much about sort of like self-assurance. It's also about the instinctive life force energy, that survival instinct, which kind of keeps you going, and also helps you to follow your convictions in a powerful way. So I think that's really interesting. But I also I'm just so fascinated by this magnetic monopole situation, that what that channel does is it switches on the center for Michael, which he doesn't have on in his, his normal kind of body graph. So it switches that center on, and it gives him a real sense of identity and purpose. So I think, as I say, there is this very interesting synastry between these two charts that I think is very beneficial to both parties. Yes, particularly because gate 7 is all about kind of the military, and as I said, he does come from the strongly military background, which is kind of almost antithesis, as I say, of where we find first of all his earth, his unconscious earth, which is in hexagram 2, which is very yin, and then also the placement of his unconscious moon, which is all about what we inherit from our mother's side of the family, traits and gifts and that kind of thing. So yes, and you can see that down here in the root. So there's this very interesting kind of overlap where he sort of brings that slightly more yin energy to Bitcoin, but at the same time Bitcoin switches on the center for him, so we're giving him a real sense of, as I say, conviction, self-awareness and self-empowerment, I think, is probably the sort of the best way to put it. And then they both have hexagram 22 in the emotional center activated, which is known as kind of beauty or grace. So this is sometimes called adornment, and I think it's interesting that this is what connects Michael's emotional center to the throat, and this channeled the 1222. And sorry, I just realized that I hadn't finished the slide. I've been a little bit inundated, so sorry about that. Yes, so anyway, as I was kind of saying, so the 1222 is the channel of openness, and this is a deeply emotional channel, and it's about self-expression, but it also connects the emotional center to the throat. So it helps people to kind of express emotion, sometimes on the collective level, on behalf of other people if they can't talk about their feelings. But it's also very good at gauging moods and then sort of being able to articulate them. So I think it's interesting that it kind of does this, and I mean Bitcoin does really allow people that kind of outlet, particularly in the Bitcoin community on social media. It does really allow people to sort of work through things on a kind of collective level that perhaps they aren't able to on their own. It's also to do with, I think the important thing as well is that, again, there's this lunar aspect to it, that you've got to cycle through your emotions, and you can only talk about them when you're ready. So timing is important here. And as I said, the solar plexus center is very much, it works on the emotional wave. So it has these overlaps with the lunar cycle. And of course, these are, lunar cycles are obviously very important to me. And they are, I think the fact that Bitcoin has the emotional authority means that lunar cycles are also important in the Bitcoin kind of dynamics, if you like. And we've seen that. We saw that, last year through most of the solar lunar phases that they coincided with important developments or pivots in Bitcoins, in the Bitcoin space. So I think this really just kind of confirms that. And then the other one is hexagram 64 in the crown. So this is not yet crossing. So this is all about kind of making transitions or preparing to make transitions. And I think it's interesting that this is shared, between these two charts. But Michael doesn't have the crown activated, which actually makes his crown center very open. So he's actually quite intuitive. But the thing is, if you don't have a center defined, you can't always control when that information kind of comes in. So I think the fact that Bitcoin switches on the 6447 for him means that it kind of gives him maybe access to intuitive information that maybe he didn't before, or to ways of reasoning or structuring information that maybe he wouldn't otherwise. So this particular channel is known as the channel of abstraction, and I think that's so interesting because the way that often he talks about Bitcoin is quite abstract. Actually, it's quite Platonic in a lot of ways, and of course the Platonic system in its sort of purest form can be a little bit kind of too rooted in idealism, and by that I mean in terms of like the mental, the cognitive, or what's kind of out there, you know, this idea of consciousness, and it can sometimes be a little bit ungrounded, you know. It's only the more kind of Eastern Platonists that kind of emphasize this need to connect the above with the below, if you like. So I think it's interesting that you know, that Bitcoin sort of switches on these two channels, and what it allows him to do is to kind of make sense of experience and to compare what he's learned through life experience, or, you know, that he's kind of read about, and look for patterns. So it connects the crown to the mind, to the third eye, and this is all about kind of discernment and clarifying things, you know. So through the prism of this ajna, he's able to assign meaning to experiences. So again, I think this idea of Bitcoin as Sophia may come from, you know, from his own personal religious or philosophical beliefs, because that channel is often associated with our personal kind of beliefs, and that I think he's sort of channeled that into Bitcoin in a way that is personal, but I think also kind of transcends that. So it's interesting. And then the final one is the hexagram 60, which is in the root center. So this is obviously important for wealth creation and for financial stability. So if you don't have the center kind of activated, then it is sometimes very hard to generate regular forms of income, or to have a lot of physical energy. You have to sort of often wait for planets to switch these centers on, and then you'll often feel a surge in sort of physical energy where you're able to kind of you know, move and sort of get things done. So this kind of shared channel in the root, as I say, is interesting. It's associated with limitation. It's actually the hexagram is associated with limitation, and it's all about kind of growth through learning one's limits, or kind of not taking excessive risks. And it's interesting how he always balances the risks that he takes with kind of hedges. And you know, this is something that I explored in the written article that I did on my blog. So you might want to go and sort of look at that if you're interested in what I was saying there. But yes, I think those are kind of the main ones that I wanted to kind of talk about in terms of shared gaze. And then in terms of channels that are activated through this kind of synastry, as I say, we have looked at the channel of expansion. The other one is that it helps both connect up the mind or the ajna to the throat center through the channel of structuring, and this is part of what they call the knowing circuit. So this is about translating insights into language and helping humanity to evolve. So as I was saying, helping humanity to rewrite its story. Now, it's often kind of about right timing, knowing when to speak or to share ideas, and we've already seen that in Michael's chart with this this need to wait to sort of cycle through the emotional wave with his solar plexus energy. So it's reiterated in this channel. So knowing when the time is right, and then sort of speaking. And what's interesting about this particular channel is that people who have it often just know. They don't know how they know. They just know. They can't explain it. It's not logical because it's coming through that central channel. You know, here you've got the three channels. This is sort of the more kind of abstract thinking. Then we've got and experience as well. And then the center one is more mystical or intuitive kind of experiences that are more spontaneous. Those kind of flashes of insight that we have, you know, similar to what we associate the planet Uranus with. And then the third channel is more about kind of logic and hypotheses and scientific kind of thought. So experimenting, you know, putting things, creating a hypothesis and then, you know, experimenting to see whether there's a kind of cause-effect relationship, etc. So, so this particular channel helps to create a why explanation. But it's important for people who have it activated to take the time to get clarity through the emotional center, to sleep on it, or wait for the lunar cycle to complete. So, you know, I think it's interesting that, as I say, that there is this link to the lunar cycle with both, and that, yeah, I just think it's something worth observing, you know, given the synastries between the Bitcoin and his moon. What, you know, how that kind of relationship works, but there clearly is a sort of an overlap there. And then we've talked about the channel of exploration, which is that kind of raw survival instinct. We've talked about the channel of openness, and the final one is the 4130, which connects up the root to the emotional center. So you can see it here in the Bitcoin chart. So this is interesting because it helps to kind of ground the emotions but it's also about, it's part of the sensing circuit, and it's all about collective experience. It's a tribal circuit actually, and the kind of bigger story of humanity. So this is where I say I think he has an important role to play in terms of helping to create a story that people who are into Bitcoin can kind of get behind, and particularly investors too, you know. So this is a channel that's all about the impetus towards the new. So it really is helping us as a collective to evolve. And it can be a little bit intense because it combines life force energy with emotional energy. But as I say, it can also help to kind of ground both centers. So it's seen in the chart of powerful dreamers and visionaries who bring to the world stories of new experiences and adventures. So it's very creative and innovative. And I think, as I said, this is his kind of gift to the Bitcoin space, is that he's very good at telling people a new story and helping them to sort of tell themselves a new story around what Bitcoin can kind of do for them. So yeah, I mean, super, super interesting. Definitely something we'll kind of come back to in the future. So that's it from me. I hope you found this interesting. Do let me know in terms of feedback how you found this, whether you enjoyed the new section on crypto profiles. I'm going to try and do it once a month, just as a kind of way to kind of get into the information in a different, sometimes more kind of personal way. And some people prefer to sort of, view things through personality. So do let me know in the feedback if you've enjoyed it, what you'd like to see, anyone you'd like me to profile, particularly if you've got chart information that isn't available in the public domain. But I am going to be doing a separate forecast for the new moon itself from a kind of more purely astrological point of view. I'm also going to look at how it links to the two full moons we had in July and August of 2021, because there's some very interesting returns of themes or kind of developments of themes that were activated or constellating then. And I think it's super interesting to see how these are almost kind of coming to a conclusion, but also kind of spiraling into a new cycle, because this is the start of a new lunar month and a new Lunar New Year. So I think, in many respects, particularly as we move into Mercury direct from the 4th of February, we really will start to feel that we kind of making a fresh start, particularly emotionally. So I want to kind of look at where we are with those themes. I think there's some interesting things that have happened recently in the public space that have prompted me to sort of rethink some of my ideas. So yes, do check that out if you're interested. And otherwise, all the best. Happy trading, happy Lunar New Year, and I'll see you again soon.